Before we begin, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new true crime story unfolding. Every week, we bring you some of the most chilling, mysterious, and unbelievable cases from across the United States. Today, we're traveling back to Oklahoma, 1987, a case that would sit in the shadows for decades, shocking a tight-knit community in ways no one could have imagined. It was a late September evening in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the kind of evening where the humid air clung to your skin and the smell of rain teased the horizon. The sky had darkened to a bruised violet, clouds rolling in from the west, heavy and low, as if the weather itself was bracing for something ominous. On the streets of this mid-sized city, life carried on much as it always had. The population hovered around 380,000, a mix of blue-collar neighborhoods, sprawling suburban streets, and the occasional cluster of run-down apartments. But in one quiet cul-de-sac in the Cherry Street district, an ordinary evening was about to turn into a nightmare. Melissa Mel Hartman was 17 years old, a girl known for her bright smile, quick laugh, and a stubborn streak that sometimes got her into trouble. She had long, wavy brown hair she often braided, green eyes that caught the sunlight like polished emeralds, and a style that was a blend of the modest and the slightly rebellious. Jeans, oversized sweaters, and sneakers she could run in if she had to. She loved the outdoors, long walks through Riverside Park, feeding squirrels and watching the geese migrate. She worked part-time at a local diner on Main Street, saving up for her senior year trip to New Orleans. Mel had plans, dreams, and a family that adored her. The Hartmans were a tight-knit family. Her father, Charles Hartman, worked as an electrician for a utility company, his hands calloused but his heart gentle. Her mother, Denise, stayed home and ran a small catering business, known across Tulsa for her pies and casseroles. Mel had an older brother, Greg, 22, who was protected but often too busy with his job at the shipping warehouse to notice the small details of his sister's life. They were not wealthy, but they were content. They believed they lived in a safe neighborhood, a place where doors were rarely locked and everyone knew their neighbors. It was a night of September 18th. Mel had stayed late at the diner, finishing her shift just after 10 p.m. The air was cool against her skin, carrying the faint scent of rain and gasoline from passing cars. She walked the 2 blocks back to her family home, earbuds in, listening to a mix of pop and classic rock. She waved to Mr. Wilson, her elderly neighbor, who was sitting on his porch with a cigarette dangling between his fingers. "Evening, Mel," he called out. She waved back, her smile bright. Everything seemed normal. But as she turned onto her street, a faint unease settled over her, though she couldn't name the source. Perhaps it was a sudden gust of wind that rattled the trash cans along the curb. Perhaps it was the distant sound of a dog barking furiously behind a fence. Whatever it was, she shrugged it off. Teenagers often feel a little thrill of fear at night, a sense of adventure walking home alone. She didn't know that this ordinary walk would become the last time anyone saw her fully alive. Inside the Hartman household, Denise was washing the dishes, humming softly, the kitchen lights casting warm glows on the counters. Charles was in his armchair, half watching a rerun of a detective show on the television, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee. The clock ticked toward 10:15 p.m. Mel should have been home by now. By 10:30, Denise's humming had stopped. She glanced at the clock again. "Charles, Mel should be here," she said, a small thread of worry tugging at her chest. Charles looked up, squinting at the clock. "She's just taking her time. Maybe stop to talk to someone. You know how she gets." But Denise didn't feel reassured. There was a subtle quiet in the air, a void where Mel's presence should have been. The street was silent now, save for the occasional passing car. The wind picked up, carrying the low rumble of approaching thunder. Denise called out, "Mel?" No answer. She tried Mel's cell phone, but in 1987, teenagers didn't carry cell phones, and Mel hadn't borrowed the house phone. Panic began to prick at the edges of Denise's calm exterior. Charles grabbed his jacket. "I'll walk around. She's probably just somewhere close by." They searched the block, calling her name, flashing the porch lights across parked cars and lawns. Mr. Wilson came out to help, the dim porch light casting long shadows across the pavement. "I haven't seen her," he said, "but I'll keep an eye out." But as minutes stretched into an hour, the worry escalated. Doors were checked, friends' houses called, but no one had seen her. By midnight, a cold knot of fear had lodged itself deep in the Hartman's stomachs. The next morning, Tulsa police were called. Officers arrived with notebooks, radios crackling, boots scuffing against the sidewalk. Detective Harold Jennings, a veteran of 20 years, was assigned to the case. He was methodical, calm, and skeptical, trained to separate panic from evidence. "Let's not jump to conclusions," he said gently to the Hartmans. "We'll find her. We start with the facts." But even he couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that settled over the case like a dark cloud. The first sweep of the neighborhood revealed little. No footprints beyond the sidewalk, no signs of struggle, no witnesses who had seen anything unusual. It was as if Mel had vanished into thin air. The wind had shifted overnight, the heavy clouds breaking into pale morning sun, but the shadow of uncertainty remained. Neighbors whispered. Rumors began to swell like storm clouds on the horizon. Some suggested she had run away. Others feared something far worse. And in the back of every mind in that small community, a chilling thought began to take root. What if Mel had been taken? Detective Jennings called in a few more officers, methodically canvassing the area. He interviewed friends at the diner, teachers at her high school, even the mail carrier who delivered to her street. Everyone painted the same picture. A happy, well-liked girl with no known enemies. No reason to disappear. Yet, the streets were empty of answers. As the day progressed, Mel's room remained untouched, her bed neatly made, her diary on a nightstand open to an unfinished page. A pink sweater she had worn the night before lay folded in a chair. Her backpack, with homework and a small notebook inside, sat abandoned in the corner. These were the remnants of her life, frozen in time, waiting for someone to unlock the truth. By nightfall, the community had gathered outside the Hartman home. People stood on porches, leaned against fences, whispered across yards. Flyers with Mel's photo, bright green eyes, wavy brown hair, a hopeful smile, were taped to telephone poles and store windows. The sense of collective dread grew heavier, suffocating in its intensity. The city that had seemed so familiar, so safe, now felt foreign, threatening. Detective Jennings looked out over the crowd, the horizon glowing dimly with the last light of the sun. Somewhere in the shadows, he thought, the truth was waiting. Somewhere, someone knew something. And for Mel Hartman, time was slipping away. But as the investigation officially began, with police cars patrolling the streets and interviews being scheduled, a troubling question lingered. Who could have taken her and why? And that is where the trail goes cold, but only for now. As the night fell over Tulsa and the city settled into uneasy sleep, no one knew that the first 24 hours of Mel's disappearance would set off a chain of events that would haunt the community for decades. Yet, even in those early hours, whispers of something darker were already beginning to spread. Whispers that hinted this was no ordinary disappearance. The first 24 hours after Melissa Hartman's disappearance were the longest any human being could endure. Time seemed elastic, stretching with every unanswered phone call, every creaking floorboard, and every shadow that flickered in the corner of the Hartman home. Denise and Charles barely slept, taking shifts pacing the small living room, staring out the window, searching the streets that now felt empty and hostile. Greg, though outwardly calm, barely ate, his jaw clenched in frustration and fear. He had grown up in this neighborhood, knew every streetlight and alley, yet the thought that someone could snatch his sister from a familiar sidewalk shook him to the core. By mid-morning, the neighborhood had transformed. Where once there had been routine, dog walkers, kids riding bikes, the occasional car driving past, there was now a tense stillness. Cars slowed as they passed the Hartman house, and neighbors leaned out of windows, whispering, watching, speculating. The sight of police tape snaking around the cul-de-sac made the reality undeniable. This wasn't just a late night, a missing teen who had stayed over at a friend's house. This was something darker. Detective Harold Jennings arrived early that morning, notebook in hand, and began door-to-door canvassing. He knocked on the doors of every home within a 2-block radius, asking the same questions over and over. Did you see anything unusual last night? Did you hear anything? Voices, cars, doors slamming? Most shook their heads, eyes wide with unease, but a few mentioned small oddities. A car parked that didn't belong to anyone on the street, a man walking by twice in the evening, but nothing concrete. Still, even vague details mattered. Jennings made careful notes, his face grim. The Hartmans clung to hope. Denise checked the front yard for footprints, retraced the path her daughter had taken, but the wet ground had erased nearly every trace. Charles called the diner, the school, Mel's friend homes, and every number he could think of. Greg drove through nearby neighborhoods, calling her name into the night air. But all roads led to silence. By afternoon, the city's local news picked up the story. Reporters descended on the Hartman home, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. 17-year-old Mel Hartman has been reported missing from her home in the Cherry Street district. One reporter said on live television, "Authorities urge anyone with information to contact the Tulsa Police Department immediately." Denise covered her face with her hands, shaking. She hated the cameras, hated the attention, but part of her knew the coverage was necessary. Every call, every tip could be the one that cracked the case. Community members began organizing themselves. Flyers printed at local copy shops appeared on telephone poles, in convenience stores, and pinned to bulletin boards at schools and churches. Friends and classmates formed search parties, walking streets and wooded areas, calling her name into the fading daylight. Even teenagers too scared to admit their worry joined in, their flashlights bobbing like fireflies across the neighborhood. Everyone wanted to help. Everyone wanted answers. And yet, as hours stretched into the evening, the absence of concrete clues began to weigh heavily. Children whispered to one another in school corridors. "Did you hear? They still haven't found Mel." Parents pulled their kids closer on the way home. A creeping fear settled over Tulsa like the low clouds overhead, an anxiety no one could shake. Inside the Hartman home, emotions ran raw. Denise paced the kitchen, her voice trembling as she muttered, "She wouldn't just leave. She wouldn't." Charles sat on the couch, rubbing his temples, muttering under his breath. Greg flopped into a chair, fists clenched, anger mixing with helplessness. "How could this happen?" he demanded, almost himself. "Who would do this?" Detective Jennings, patient but concerned, tried to calm the family. "We'll follow every lead," he assured them. "We'll interview everyone who might have seen something. The first hours are critical. I promise we'll do everything we can." But he knew, as every seasoned detective does, that missing person cases were a race against time, and every hour that passed without a lead made the odds more grim. By the second night, the story had spread beyond the city. Oklahoma City radio stations picked it up. Neighboring towns whispered about the missing girl, and phone lines at the police department were flooded with tips, some helpful, some misleading. One caller claimed to have seen a blue van parked near Mel Street around the time she disappeared. Another insisted they had noticed a man loitering near the park, where she sometimes walked. Jennings methodically followed each lead, but so far, nothing panned out. Despite the fear, moments of small hope flickered. A friend of Mel's reported seeing a shadowy figure near Riverside Park the previous day, describing a man wearing a green jacket. Another neighbor remembered hearing the faint rev of a car engine around 10:15 p.m. on the night she vanished. Nothing concrete, but a thread of possibility. It was enough for the Hartmans to cling to. And yet, as the search continued into the third day, a chilling realization began to set in. Mel Hartman might not return on her own. The cheerful girl who walked confidently down familiar streets could be somewhere out of reach, trapped, frightened, perhaps injured. The thought made Denise's stomach knot. Her hands tremble, her nights sleepless. Charles barely slept, haunted by visions of his daughter. Tried to remember every detail. The way she tied her shoes, the laugh she made when Greg teased her, the green eyes that always seemed to reflect the sky. Even the smallest details took on a heightened significance. The smell of wet asphalt in the morning brought a pang of anxiety. The sound of a distant siren made the family jump. The ticking of a clock in the living room became unbearable. Every ordinary thing seemed to whisper reminders that Mel was missing, that something had gone terribly wrong. By the fourth day, the initial shock had shifted into frantic action. Search teams expanded beyond the neighborhood. covering parks, abandoned buildings, rivers, and industrial areas. Volunteers combed the city with flashlights and dogs, calling her name into alleys and over rooftops. Detective Jennings coordinated the efforts with precision, trying to balance the urgency of the search with methodical investigative work. Interviews multiplied. Witness statements poured in. Each new lead sparked a flicker of hope, then often died quickly under scrutiny. Even as the city rallied, a sense of unease gripped the Hartman family. Greg refused to sleep more than a few hours at a time, patrolling streets near the neighborhood with a baseball bat. Denise started keeping a journal of every tip, every phone call, every sighting, hoping to find a pattern. Charles, stoic outwardly, stayed up late researching abductions and missing person cases online, desperate for insight, desperate to find a clue that might break the case. But despite the relentless effort, one truth became increasingly clear. Someone had taken Mel Hartman, and the person was still out there. And in the shadows, just beyond reach, the secrets of that night in September 1987 remained carefully hidden, waiting for a thread that could unravel decades of silence. The city's collective anxiety swelled. News crews kept rolling. Neighbors whispered, and families double-checked their own doors and windows, hearts hammering in the dark. The Hartman home became a focal point of grief, hope, and fear, a symbol of innocence suddenly shattered. And as Detective Jennings prepared to pursue the next set of leads, a chilling possibility began to surface. What if the person responsible wasn't a stranger? The question hung in the air like the low clouds over Tulsa, ominous, suffocating, and unanswered. As the investigation pressed forward and every potential lead was chased to a dead end, the Hartman family and the entire Tulsa community began to face an unsettling reality. The truth about Mel's disappearance might lie closer to home than anyone dared imagine, and it was only a matter of time before the shadows hiding that truth would begin to move. The days following Melissa Hartman's disappearance stretched into a tense blur. In the Hartman household, silence and despair became their constant companions. Denise barely left the kitchen, clutching mugs of cold coffee as she reread every note, every tip, every possible lead. Her eyes were red-rimmed from exhaustion, her skin pale from sleepless nights. Charles, usually calm and practical, walked the house with a grim expression, calling friends and distant relatives, try to cover every angle, every possibility. Greg, younger, more impulsive, refused to stay inside. He patrolled the neighborhood with a baseball bat in hand, scanning the shadows, muttering under his breath, "You won't get away with this." Outside, the community had fractured into two overlapping responses: fear and fierce action. The Cherry Street district, normally a quiet, close-knit neighborhood, had become a place of whispers and watchfulness. Streetlights now seemed to cast suspicious shadows. Doors that were once left unlocked were now bolted tight. Residents hung posters of Mel on every telephone pole, every storefront, and every church bulletin board. Children who had once played freely in yards now stayed close to home, their parents' watchful eyes never far. Churches organized prayer vigils, bringing together families from across Tulsa to light candles and pray for Mel's safe return. The scent of burning candles and incense filled the small sanctuaries, a mixture of comfort and solemnity. "We're asking God protect her," one neighbor said softly, tears running down her face. Another added, "She's a child of this community. We won't stop looking until she's home." The unity was heartfelt, yet laced with anxiety. Every shadow outside the stained glass windows seemed to carry a secret. Every passing car a potential threat. Friends of Mel were deeply shaken. At school, whispers floated through the hallways like a cold wind. Classmates compared every detail: who last saw her, what she wore, what she said in passing. "She seemed fine," one girl said, hugging herself in the cafeteria. "I don't understand why she wouldn't tell us if something was wrong." Others offered faint hope, recalling her laughter and stubborn streak, insisting that Mel could have wandered somewhere safe. But as the days stretched on, hope mingled with dread, a bitter cocktail no teenager should have to swallow. Meanwhile, the local media fanned the flames of tension. Television crews filmed outside the Hartman home, capturing the worried faces of neighbors, the flyers plastered across street signs, and the constant presence of police cars. Radio hosts replayed Mel's description, urging listeners to call in with any sightings. "It's every parent's nightmare," one anchor said. "A young girl, just 17, vanishes without a trace. The community is on edge, hoping for answers." For Denise and Charles, the coverage was both a lifeline and a source of distress. The more tension, the greater the chance someone would come forward. But it also meant their private anguish was public, displayed for everyone to see. Roughly a week into the search, the city began feeling the strain. Businesses near Cherry Street reported slow days. Parents drove their children farther from the neighborhood to keep them safe. Rumors circulated quickly. Some claimed to have seen Mel walking near Riverside Park late at night. Others spoke of suspicious cars idling in the cul-de-sac. There were even whispers of strangers moving through town. Detective Jennings treated each tip carefully, but each one that led nowhere only deepened the community's fear. One afternoon, a meeting was called at the local firehouse, attended by neighbors, city council members, and the Hartman family. The air was thick with tension, the faint smell of smoke from the firehouse kitchen mingling with the scent of coffee and nervous sweat. People spoke in hushed tones, offering theories, sharing sightings, and recounting every detail they could remember. "We have to stick together," one neighbor said, her voice trembling. "We can't let fear take over." Another suggested neighborhood watch patrols, noting every unfamiliar car and person on the streets. Through all this, the Hartmans' private grief intertwined with the public anxiety. Denise began to experience waves of guilt, wondering if she could have prevented the disappearance. "I should have walked her home," she muttered to Charles one night. Charles, ever the steady presence, held her hand. "You did everything you could," he said softly, but even he felt powerless against the invisible force that had taken his daughter. Greg, meanwhile, had become a fixture at the police station. He pored over maps, traced possible routes, and insisted on joining search parties, even in the rain. Detective Jennings appreciated the dedication, but cautioned him against taking unnecessary risks. "I know you want answers," Jennings said, "but you can't search the city alone. You're part of the team when you follow protocol." Greg nodded, frustrated but understanding, the tension between urgency and patience gnawing at him constantly. Despite the mounting fear, small acts of solidarity persisted. Neighbors brought meals, checking in on the Hartmans. Friends volunteered for extended search shifts, combing wooded areas, abandoned lots, and riverside paths. Church groups organized rides to distribute flyers to surrounding towns. Every effort was a flicker of hope amid the uncertainty. Yet the city's anxiety had its darker side. As speculation ran rampant, some residents began pointing fingers at neighbors, questioning strangers, and harboring suspicion toward anyone who seemed even slightly out of place. Late-night arguments erupted over minor disagreements, fueled by fear and exhaustion. In one case, a man was briefly detained after a neighbor reported him loitering near a schoolyard, only to be released when no connection was found. The intensity of the search had transformed the entire community into a pressure cooker of fear, vigilance, and raw emotion. Meanwhile, within the Hartman family, tension mounted further. Denise's grief deepened, manifesting in sudden tears and anxious pacing. Charles began obsessing over every detail of Mel's room, her notebooks, her belongings, the way she left her shoes. Greg, younger and more impulsive, oscillated between bouts of quiet reflection and aggressive action, convinced that the person responsible could be anyone. The emotional strain was immense, threatening to fracture the family at the very moment they needed to remain united. And as days turned into weeks, the city's hope began to waver. Flyers faded in the sun. Search parties became less frequent. News crews moved on to other stories. But the Hartmans refused to give up, holding on to belief that Mel was alive somewhere, that someone somewhere knew the truth. Detective Jennings, now deeply entrenched in the case, continued methodically collecting every shred of information. He knew the longer the case went unsolved, the colder it became, and yet he also understood that in true crime, even the coldest cases can shatter with a single breakthrough. But as the weeks passed, a troubling pattern emerged. Leads began to dry up. Witnesses retracted statements. Rumors contradicted each other. And in quiet, private moments, a chilling realization took hold. The person responsible for Mel Hartman's disappearance might never have been seen by anyone at all. With the community growing weary, tension rising, and hope fading, the investigation reached a point of critical uncertainty. Every door knocked, every tip followed, every shadow scrutinized seemed to lead to a dead end. The question that would haunt Detective Jennings and the Hartman family alike loomed larger than ever. How do you catch someone who has left no trace? Detective Harold Jennings knew from the start that Melissa Hartman's disappearance would test every skill he had acquired over 20 years in law enforcement. Missing person cases were notoriously difficult. Clues were scarce, memories unreliable, and the faintest lead could dissolve into a dead end. But from the moment he took the call, Jennings dedicated himself fully to Mel's case. He pored over reports, interviewed every friend, neighbor, and acquaintance, and scrutinized every tip that came into the Tulsa Police Department. In the first week, dozens of leads flooded in. Some were earnest, others were wild guesses, and a few were cruel pranks. One caller claimed to have seen Mel get into a blue van with tinted windows near Riverside Park. Another insisted a man in a green jacket had been watching her the night she disappeared. Officers chased each tip relentlessly, driving through side streets, questioning strangers, checking local businesses, and reviewing every possible angle. Yet, none produced the break the detectives so desperately needed. At the diner where Mel had worked, Jennings spent hours speaking with employees, hoping someone had noticed anything unusual. A co-worker mentioned a man who had come in several times during the week, always sitting near the window, scribbling in a notebook. "He gave me the creeps," the woman admitted, voice trembling. The description was vague, but officers canvassed the nearby streets and surrounding neighborhoods. Nothing. Investigators also explored the possibility of acquaintances or friends being involved. Mel's social circle was carefully questioned. Each friend recalled her cheerfulness, her plans for the upcoming school dance, her obsession with writing short stories in her notebook. None could think of anyone who might have wanted to harm her. Still, detectives pursued the lines of inquiry, interviewing classmates, teachers, and neighbors. Every friendly face was now a potential suspect. Every casual remark a clue or a trap. Then came the leads that shattered hope with frustration. A local man, known for his odd behavior, was reported to have been seen near the Hartman house around 10:15 p.m. He was brought in for questioning. The man's statements were inconsistent. He claimed to have been at home, then at a friend's, and finally said he had taken a long walk to clear his head. Jennings and his team conducted a thorough investigation, checking phone records, neighbors' accounts, and alibis. The man was cleared. Each false lead added layers of tension, gnawing at the community's nerves and testing the detective's patience. Even family acquaintances came under scrutiny. Greg Hartman's friends, casual neighborhood acquaintances, and even extended family were questioned. Each one faced the possibility, however remote, of being a suspect. It was a brutal reality of investigations. Suspicion could touch anyone, even those who had nothing to hide. Every interview required patience and tact, balancing the need for truth with the risk of alienating the very community whose cooperation was crucial. Amid this flurry of activity, technology of the time offered little help. 1987 Tulsa had no cell phone records to track, no surveillance cameras on most streets, and no databases that could instantly connect clues. Investigators relied on landline phone records, vehicle registrations, eyewitness accounts, and sheer legwork. Each piece of information was painstakingly analyzed, cross-checked, and filed, creating a mountain of paperwork that could bury any single lead in bureaucratic weight. One of the most promising early leads emerged when a neighbor reported a suspicious car, a dark green Chevrolet Caprice, parked near the cul-de-sac late at night. Officers traced it to a man with a minor criminal record, living just outside Tulsa. He was brought in for questioning. Under Jennings' calm but firm approach, the man admitted he had been out driving, but claimed no contact with Mel. Police found no evidence tying him to the disappearance. The Caprice was cleared, but by then, rumors had already spread through the community. Fear had metastasized into suspicion. Another misleading trail came from a claim that a stranger had been seen near Riverside Park, talking to a teenage girl matching Mel's description. Officers scoured the park at dawn, flashlight beams slicing through early morning fog. They searched the trails, inspected the benches, and even questioned joggers and early walkers. Nothing. The park, once a place of peace, became a maze of dead ends and imagined threats. The pressure on Jennings and his team was immense. Each day, without a breakthrough, added weight to their shoulders. They worked long hours, piecing together timelines, comparing witness statements, and trying to discern patterns in the chaos. And while the community rallied with prayers, searches, and support, the detectives faced a silent battle, chasing shadows, following false leads, and confronting the ever-growing fear that time was slipping irreversibly away. Even the Hartman family became victims of the frustration. Flyers faded, searches dwindled, and hope began to flicker in small, fragile ways. Denise would wake in the middle of the night, convinced she had heard Mel calling her name. Charles scoured the city maps, tried to imagine every possible escape route, every hiding place. Greg, restless and angry, argued with detectives over the pursuit of leads, frustrated at the pace and seeming futility. Tensions ran high in the household, each family member wrestling with guilt, fear, and a gnawing need for answers. Meanwhile, the community's anxiety simmered. Residents doubled their vigilance, watching unfamiliar cars, strangers, and even each other with suspicion. Rumors of Mel being taken by someone she knew began to circulate, though no proof existed. Social dynamics shifted. Friends who had been close now hesitated to trust one another, and neighborhood bonds frayed under the pressure of fear. Even everyday sounds, a car door slamming, a dog barking, could trigger panic. Despite the dead ends, Jennings refused to relent. He revisited old tips, cross-referenced statements, and meticulously reviewed every detail from the first night. A subtle pattern emerged. The timing of reports, the sightings of vehicles, and the inconsistencies in witness accounts suggested that someone had prepared, planned, and perhaps even waited for the opportunity to take Mel. The case was no longer just a disappearance. It was becoming a portrait of calculated intent, masked by chaos and coincidence. Then, almost imperceptibly, a sense of urgency shifted in Jennings. Among the mountains of false leads, one overlooked detail began to stand out. A witness statement about a man seen near the Hartman Street just after 10:15 p.m., describing him as nervous, constantly checking his surroundings. Initially dismissed as a passing curiosity, Jennings felt a spark of intuition. It wasn't proof, but it was something, a thread that could unravel decades of silence if followed carefully. Yet even as this glimmer of possibility emerged, the detectives were painfully aware of the dangers of obsession. Many cases ended in frustration, cold leads, and shattered families. Tulsa's community, once united in hope, was now fragile, weary from false alarms and dead ends. Every misstep could erode trust further. Every unproven tip could fuel fear. The pressure on Jennings, his team, and the Hartmans intensified with each passing day. And in the back of every mind, the detectives, the family, the community, lurking in the shadows, was a terrifying realization. The person responsible was still out there, watching, waiting, untouchable. As weeks turned into months, and months stretched into years, the investigation slowed, but never stopped. Leads faded, community hope dimmed, and the Hartman family grappled with the unbearable weight of uncertainty. The case became a cold file in the Tulsa Police Department, a haunting reminder that sometimes the truth lies buried until the right discovery unlocks it. But somewhere in the shadows, a single piece of evidence had quietly survived the passage of time, waiting for the day it could finally expose the person who took Mel Hartman. As the initial flurry of leads dried up, the case of Melissa Hartman began to settle into the dreaded category of cold cases. The frenetic pace of the first weeks gave way to long, tense periods of waiting, reviewing old evidence, and hoping that something, anything, would point them in the right direction. Detective Harold Jennings and his team refused to give up, but even their seasoned optimism was tested as months turned into years. By the time 1988 rolled around, Tulsa had largely moved on. Flyers of Mel's face had faded. Her disappearance a story relegated to the occasional newspaper column or brief mention on the local news. Yet inside the police department, Jennings kept the file active. Every now and then, a tip would trickle in, a call from someone who suddenly remembered a vague detail, a suspicious vehicle they had seen years ago, or a person acting strangely around the time of the disappearance. Most turned out to be dead ends, but a few offered enough information to keep the investigation alive. One of the few concrete pieces of evidence came from Mel's clothing. Her pink sweater, folded and left in her bedroom, had traces of fibers that forensic analysts carefully documented. A single, tiny thread of blue denim, not from Mel's own jeans, was found entangled in the fabric. It seemed inconsequential at first, but in retrospect, Jennings believed it might have been a clue to someone else's presence. The forensic tools of the late 80s were primitive by today's standards. DNA profiling was in its infancy, but officers documented every detail meticulously, hoping future advancements would allow them to make connections that weren't possible at the time. The family's home was examined repeatedly. Dust samples, fingerprints, and the minor scuffs on the staircase were all cataloged. Nothing pointed directly to a suspect, yet the meticulous collection preserved evidence that would become critical years later. Even the small notebook Mel had left open on her nightstand was analyzed for handwriting patterns, contacts, and any subtle notes that might have revealed a premonition of danger. Her last entry, a half-finished story about a girl wandering through a foggy park, seemed almost eerily prophetic. As time passed, the case transitioned fully into a cold case phase. Assignments shifted, detectives moved to other investigations, and the active search parties were disbanded. The Hartman family continued living with gnawing uncertainty, holding on to faint hope that new information could arrive at any time. Denise began documenting everything, maintaining a meticulous journal of memories, leads, and interactions with law enforcement. Greg stayed close to the police, checking in periodically, unwilling to let the case fade entirely. Charles, ever methodical, reviewed old reports late into the night, scanning for anything previously overlooked. The cold case period brought its own challenges. Investigators struggled against the limits of technology and memory. Witnesses who had initially provided statements were harder to locate or recalled events differently, sometimes contradicting their original accounts. Neighborhoods changed, street layout evolved, and the passage of time blurred small details that might once have been crucial. And yet, even in the staleness of the investigation, a single spark remained, that small fragment of denim in Mel's sweater. It was minute, almost dismissible, but it was a tangible connection to the person who had been with her that night. In 1991, forensic science began to take leaps forward. DNA profiling, still rare, became more accurate and usable in criminal investigations. Jennings had the fiber samples from Mel's sweater re-examined in a modern lab. The results were inconclusive at first, offering nothing directly actionable, but they provided hope that one day, the right match could emerge. The tiny thread of denim, preserved under careful conditions, was now a potential key. Meanwhile, the Hartman family endured the social and emotional fallout of a case that refused to close. Neighbors avoided the topic, unsure how to offer comfort. Friends drifted away, unable to handle persistent grief. Denise, in particular, experienced waves of despair followed by bursts of resolve. "I will not let them forget her," she often told Charles, her voice raw with determination. "She deserves to be found. She deserves justice." Charles nodded silently, understanding that hope had to be nurtured even when it seemed fragile. By the mid-1990s, the case had grown cold in the eyes of many, but the files remained active. Every now and then, Jennings revisited old leads, calling former witnesses, re-examining statements, and looking at the evidence with fresh eyes. One such review uncovered a minor inconsistency in a witness statement about the green jacket man seen near Riverside Park. While initially dismissed, the discrepancy now hinted at the possibility that he had returned to the area later than first reported. Small, almost insignificant details like this gave Jennings a sense that the case might still be solvable. The cold case phase also revealed the fragility of memory. Witnesses who had once seemed reliable now recalled different sequences, sometimes even conflicting with each other. Yet Jennings knew that persistence mattered more than certainty. Every piece of evidence, every account, was cataloged carefully, and every thread, no matter how small, was preserved for day when forensic technology or a tip might finally bring clarity. Throughout all this, the city of Tulsa remained quietly aware of Mel Hartman. Her absence was like a ghost lingering in streets, parks, and neighborhoods. Community members occasionally pass her old house, remembering the girl with the bright smile, green eyes, and stubborn streak. Even years later, church vigils were held, friends sent letters, and family gatherings included whispered prayers for a safe return. Mel's disappearance had left a permanent mark on the city, a reminder that innocence could vanish in an instant, and that justice sometimes required decades to unfold. But then, decades after the initial investigation began, a breakthrough would emerge, one that no one in Tulsa could have anticipated. The evidence collected in those first frantic days, the fibers, the notebook, the minor inconsistencies, would finally converge, setting the stage for a shocking revelation. It was a day that would not only end decades of uncertainty, but also reveal a truth that would shake the community to its core. And so, after more than 20 years of painstaking work, cold nights, dead-end leads, and painstaking forensic reanalysis, the quiet pieces of evidence that had been patiently preserved were about to ignite a chain of events that would lead to the arrest of the person responsible for Mel Hartman's disappearance. But no one could yet imagine the shock it would deliver to the entire community. After more than 2 decades, the case that had haunted Tulsa finally cracked. It began not with a dramatic tip or sudden confession, but with the quiet persistence of forensic science catching up to the meticulous evidence preserved all those years ago. The tiny blue denim thread found in Melissa Hartman's sweater, long thought to be an insignificant detail, had been subjected to the latest DNA analysis. In a small lab in Oklahoma City, technicians compared the sample against national databases, a long shot, given the passage of time, yet a necessary one. And then it happened, a match. Detective Harold Jennings was summoned immediately. The name that came back startled him. James Edward Nolan, a 42-year-old man living quietly in the Tulsa suburbs, with a history of minor offenses and a life that, on the surface, seemed unremarkable. But the DNA evidence connected him directly to that single fiber in Mel's sweater. The realization hit Jennings with the weight of decades of unanswered questions. The man responsible for Mel's disappearance, someone who had evaded suspicion all these years, had finally been identified. Officers prepared for the arrest carefully. They knew the significance of the moment and the potential danger. A team of 6 detectives and uniformed officers approached Nolan's home just after dawn. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew and freshly cut grass. The quiet neighborhood was suddenly disrupted by the sound of footsteps, radios crackling, and doors banging as the team approached the front porch. Nolan answered the door casually, as if expecting visitors for coffee rather than a criminal investigation. Jennings identified himself and calmly read the man his rights, explaining that he was under arrest for the abduction of Melissa Hartman. Nolan's face betrayed no immediate shock. Instead, he seemed almost resigned, as if he had anticipated this day for years, quietly living with the consequences of a crime no one had been able to prove, until now. The arrest sent ripples through the Tulsa community. News of Nolan's capture spread quickly, turning conversations into gasps of disbelief. The man who had lived quietly, blending into the background of a suburban neighborhood, was the same person who had taken a young girl 21 years earlier. Reporters swarmed the Hartman home, broadcasting the arrest live, while neighbors murmured in shock, unable to reconcile the ordinary man next door with a horrifying crime. For the Hartman family, the news was surreal. Denise wept openly, clutching Charles's hand as the magnitude of the moment hit her. "We finally have him," she whispered, voice shaking. Greg stood in stunned silence, fists clenched, unable to articulate the storm of relief, anger, and disbelief swirling inside him. Finally, after 21 years of uncertainty, the person who had taken their daughter had been apprehended. Investigators quickly assembled a timeline, confirming the evidence and connecting the dots. Nolan had been living within a few miles of the Hartman neighborhood at the time of Mel's disappearance. He had managed to evade detection through a combination of careful planning and the community's trust. But the preserved fiber, combined with advancements in forensic analysis, had finally unraveled the carefully constructed silence. The court case moved swiftly. While some procedural steps delayed the trial, the overwhelming DNA evidence, coupled with historical investigative records, made Nolan's guilt undeniable. As testimony unfolded, the horror of that September night in 1987 resurfaced. His actions, the planning, and the cold calculation that had allowed him to escape scrutiny for decades. For the Hartman family, each detail was both painful and cathartic, a confirmation of what they had long suspected but never been able to prove. The community's reaction was a mix of relief and disbelief. Neighbors who had once doubted, who had whispered suspicions about each other, now faced a reality that the threat had been hiding in plain sight. Vigils were held once more, not for hope of finding Mel, but for closure, justice, and acknowledgement of the years stolen from a family and community. The arrest shattered the illusion of safety in Tulsa, a city that prided itself on tight-knit neighborhoods, leaving a lasting impact that would not soon fade. And yet, even with the arrest, questions lingered. How had Nolan managed to escape suspicion for so long? How had he avoided detection despite the countless investigations, interviews, and police work? And most hauntingly, what had truly happened to Melissa that night? A truth Nolan alone could answer? The arrest marked the end of a long search, but the emotional journey for the Hartmans and the Tulsa community was far from over. Justice, finally served, was bittersweet, carried with the weight of lost years, stolen innocence, and enduring trauma. With Nolan behind bars, the Hartman family began to confront the emotional aftermath, reckoning with decades of fear, grief, and uncertainty. The arrest answered some questions, but also reopened old wounds, forcing the community to reflect on the impact of a crime that had haunted them for more than 20 years. The arrest of James Edward Nolan brought a sense of closure that the Hartman family had long yearned for, yet it was not the kind of relief that erased pain. Denise Hartman sat on the edge of her daughter's now empty bedroom bed, her hands clasped, staring at the faded posters still pinned to the walls. Memories of Mel, her laughter, her stubborn insistence on staying up late to write stories, her green eyes sparkling with mischief, flooded back. The justice served by Nolan's arrest could not give back the years lost, the birthdays missed, or the quiet moments forever stolen. Charles stood beside her, silent, offering presence rather than words. Greg had returned from the police station, still numb from the whirlwind of events, struggling to reconcile the man who had lived undetected among them for decades with the frightening truth of his crime. "It's over," Charles whispered. "He can't hurt anyone else." But even as he said it, he understood that some wounds never fully heal. The Tulsa community, too, experienced a profound reckoning. Neighbors who had grown suspicious of one another found a renewed sense of relief but also shame. Guilt for the doubt cast on innocent friends and gratitude that the perpetrator had finally been found. Local churches organized gatherings to honor the perseverance of the Hartman family, acknowledging both the pain endured and the hope that had kept them searching for decades. Vigils were held with candles flickering against the cool night air. Prayers spoken aloud for the resilience of a family that had refused to give up. Detective Harold Jennings reflected quietly on the journey that had spanned over 20 years. The investigation had been long, painstaking, and often disheartening. Yet it was a testament to persistence, attention to detail, and the slow, inexorable progress of justice. Sometimes, the truth hides in the smallest detail. Jennings said later in an interview, "It takes time, patience, and relentless dedication to find it. But when it comes to justice, even decades can't erase the possibility of closure." For the Hartmans, life slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy, though it was forever altered. Denise took comfort in the community support, finding solace in their shared acknowledgement of Mel's story. Charles devoted himself to mentoring programs, working to prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. Greg, once consumed by anger and frustration, channeled his energy into advocacy for missing children, speaking openly about the emotional toll of unresolved cases. Their grief remained, but was now interwoven with resilience, remembrance, and a hard-earned sense of justice. Even Tulsa itself felt the imprint of the case. The neighborhood around Cherry Street became more vigilant, neighbors more watchful, yet closer in their bonds. Parents who had once assumed safety now taught their children about caution and awareness. And the story of Melissa Hartman became a cautionary tale and a symbol of hope, that even in the darkest times, perseverance, community, and evidence could illuminate the truth. And though the arrest had answered many questions, some mysteries remained. Small details of that night in 1987 that only Nolan could explain. Fleeting moments that could never be retrieved. But the most important truth endured. Mel Hartman's disappearance was no longer a shadow over Tulsa. Justice had been served, and the person responsible had been held accountable. As Denise walked through the neighborhood one evening, past the same street she had searched endlessly in the weeks after Mel vanished, she felt a strange mixture of sorrow and peace. The wind carried the faint smell of autumn leaves and distant rain, the same wind that had once swept to the cul-de-sac while her daughter was missing. "We can finally breathe," she whispered, a tear rolling down her cheek. "We can finally breathe." The story of Mel Hartman's disappearance and the decades-long pursuit of justice serves as a reminder. Even when the world seems silent, even when hope appears lost, persistence, truth, and community vigilance can illuminate the darkness. Time may pass, memories may fade, but justice, once found, leaves a lasting mark, not just on the victims, but on all those who refuse to forget.